Good afternoon, everyone. There are still a few people joining us from the waiting room, but I think we should probably start as we only have an hour today. My name's Jane Winters, and I'm Professor of Digital Humanities at the School of Advanced Study in the University of London. And it's my great pleasure to be chairing this session today, which is looking at exploring history in the digital world. If any of you signed up early for this session, you may notice that the programme has changed very slightly. We're very grateful to two of our speakers, Linda Arnold-Stratford and Mia Ridge, for stepping in at the last minute to help us out when a couple of the speakers were unavailable. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Jonathan Blaney, who is Head of Digital Projects and Editor of British History Online. I should say that we're going to have all of the presentations first, and then we'll take discussion at the end. They're very short presentations. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat, and we'll try to pick up as many of them as we can. So over to you, Jonathan.
Hi, Jane. Thanks very much. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully you can see what's coming up. So I work on British History Online, which is an online library of key sources for the history of the British Isles. Most of our texts on there are free to everyone all of the time, but about 20% of them are premium content. From the end of March to the beginning of October, we made the premium transcriptions free as well to everyone, as a service to historians of all kinds when libraries and archives were closed. This was costly, and I'll come back briefly to that at the end, but we roughly doubled our page views across the site over the same 6-month period last year. So we know it was useful to lots of people, and some people wrote in to thank us for it. And because BHO is an excellent finding aid for primary sources, we also always get lots of email asking us about access to original documents that people have found through BHO, particularly people who haven't been formally trained in the use of archival sources. So I thought I'd mention some great new content we have on BHO this year, which helps a little bit with that. It's transcriptions of 2,500 English petitions from the 16th to the 18th centuries. Here's an example from Staffordshire. This is a group petition by the neighbours of a couple called Richard and Ellen Wise, that they'd be able to continue keeping their inn that they've had in the village for 20 years. And it says that they've always offered good provision at all times. So it's kind of like a 17th century TripAdvisor. But the problem with things like this is that everything on a computer screen looks kind of similar, doesn't it? You don't really get a sense of what's behind it. So I'm really glad that with this project, we've been able to add in 14 cases, images of the original petitions, and including the one we just looked at in transcription, which is this one here. And you can see there, you get much better sense now of what's actually behind it, what the document is. And if you go to the archive, what you can expect. And this is a good time for people interested in this kind of thing to practice their paleography skills. So you can go from this transcription to, from the transcription by experts in 17th century handwriting, I should say, not me, to the image and back, and start to hone those skills so that you can get back to the archives and more effectively very soon. This year, we've also added listings of history theses awarded in the UK and Ireland between 1970 and 2014. That's about 20,000 theses. And we've made the data behind the listings openly available. So you can do analytical work on the data if you want to. You do have to be careful about drawing conclusions because the listings are not complete or consistent, but you can do things like this. This is a quick graph I made from the data of uses of the word gender, women, woman, and masculine in those titles over that period. So women is at the top. You can see a trend upwards in interest in women, very broadly speaking. I know this is crude. And at the bottom, the green line is masculine, which just has a slight uptick at the end of the 1990s. But all this data is available. You can do much more considered and interesting work than that, but it's an example of the kind of things you can do. And breaking news, this week, I've added links from the theses listing to their entry on the British Library's thesis service, Ethos. So this is our listing on BHO now. Not everything has a link because we have a different scope to Ethos, but we have about 11,000 links now. If you're interested, for example, in the second one down, Aspects of Chivalric Culture by Juliet Vale, you can now click straight through to the listing on ethos. Looks like that. With more recent theses, you also get an abstract, which is very useful. What happens now does vary according to the institution where the thesis was awarded, but in this case, we can click straight through to the University of York's repository. And then on the right-hand side of the page, you can see there's a download link for the PDF of the full thesis. So that means what you can do now is go straight from browsing chivalry on BHO to reading a full-length expert thesis on the same topic. All of this while in lockdown. So here are the URLs of what I've just shown you. Everything is free and you don't need a login for anything that I've just shown you. To finish, I want to come back to that question of cost. British History Online costs a lot of money to maintain every year, even without adding more material. And I think we all need to have a discussion about our expectations of what's online, of what's free, and of what we're prepared collectively or individually to pay for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think that's a really good example of the value not just of publishing things online, but of linking them up and helping people to find a pathway through all of this information. Thank you. Our second speaker today is Katherine Howells, who's a visual collections researcher at the National Archives, and she's going to be talking about some of the digital projects at TNA. Katherine, over to you.
Thanks, Jane. I'll just share my screen. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to this panel. Yes, I'm visual collections researcher at the National Archives, so I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that I'm involved in. So of course, my interest is the visual collections, visual materials that we hold, which a lot of people don't realize we have sometimes, but we actually hold huge collections of registered designs, artwork, photographs, mostly from the 19th and 20th centuries. And as these aren't very well known, we're constantly looking for ways to improve access to them. And the closure of the building has kind of spurred this on in many ways, because it's given us new opportunities and new enthusiasm for trying to make this work. So I'm just going to run through quickly a couple of interesting projects. The first is to do with visual search, which is a much larger project that's been going on for a little while, which is a collaboration between the National Archives, the University of Surrey, Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh, and the V&A. And the aim for this project is to explore how we can use visual search to bring collections together. And they're focusing on the collections of botanic images. So in our collection, this tends to be our wallpaper and textile designs that have images of plants and flowers and things like this example. And what we want to do, what the aim is to create a search platform where you could search by the concept, by something like a certain flower, and then be able to find different materials that show the same flower, but in different designs. So it's something that's an exploratory project to work out whether this is something that can be achieved in the future. And obviously, in terms of our huge visual collections, this would be amazing if we could achieve something where you could search which didn't rely on metadata necessarily, didn't rely on descriptions, because obviously some of these kind of textile designs are very difficult to describe in a useful way. Then there's a project that I'm involved in that I'm kind of trying to lead on now, trying to expand on, which involves our copyright records. And these are photographs, paintings, and drawings submitted for copyright protection between 1842 and 1924. We have a massive collection of these. And these are just some examples of the photographs we have, but they're also artwork, advertising, all this kind of material. And one of the things we've been doing to try and improve access to this collection is to expand our remote cataloguing. So some of the material has already been catalogued. Some of it we were currently cataloguing with volunteers. Obviously that has had to stop for now, but we've tried to expand what we can put on online for people to catalogue, and this has been really successful with the copyright records. So I've been able to photograph lots of the copyright records, put them up on the platform from the page to allow people to catalogue them, to write descriptions for them, which is very, very fast. It's because there's so many people who are interested that we can get this done a lot quicker. The other area that I've been looking at is how we can use the data itself that's already in the catalogue. So obviously a lot of these things rely on digitized images, and that's great, but there are always going to be quite a lot of records that aren't digitized, and it's a shame to kind of neglect them when there's actually really useful information in the catalogue data itself. So in our copyright records, each one is an image attached to a form like this, and in the form you can see a description of the work and the name of the creator and the name of the person registering it. So each image is actually evidence of a relationship between two people in the past, and some kind of productive relationship. And this information, when it's catalogued, which it is for all our photographs, is in the catalogue, is easily downloadable, easily accessible, easily kind of analyzable, as it were. And so what I realized was this is a huge opportunity, really. We can actually use network analysis to actually explore this data. And I've tried this out with some of our copyright data that's already in the catalogue that anyone can download. There's a huge amount of data, so it's quite a task, but this is just for 1 year. I've tested it for 1 year. And you can create network graphs where you can see the relationships between photographers and the companies that they worked for. You can sort of pull out particular examples of photographers who worked alone or photographers who worked with lots of different people. You can work out who was the most influential in that particular year. There's so many things that you can discover from this data. And it's something that hopefully in the future, I'll be able to expand to cover, hopefully, the whole of the copyright collection, and make it accessible to people to use as a search technique so that they can explore the data online, find the photographs that way, and just get into this collection, which sometimes can seem quite sort of difficult to access when there are ways to access the data in a more immersive way, in a more interesting way. Yeah, so those are the main projects I'm involved with, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Katherine. I know there's some amazing material in Copy One, so finding these ways to open it up for historians of design, fashion students, constituencies who wouldn't normally maybe think of the National Archives for that kind of information. So thank you very much. Our third speaker is Linda Arnold-Stratford, who is Head of Liaison and Governance for the Legal Deposit Libraries, and she's based at the British Library. And Linda's going to talk a little bit about electronic legal deposit.
Thank you, Jane. Yes, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. So as Jane said, I'm based at the British Library, but UK Legal Deposit really is a collaboration between the 6 legal deposit libraries across the UK and Ireland. So that includes the British Library, National Library of Scotland, National Library of Wales, Bodleian Library, Cambridge University Library, and of course, Trinity College Dublin. We've been collecting electronic legal deposit since about 2013, and it's now a really extensive collection. We have over 8 million e-journal articles, over 600,000 e-books, 760 terabytes of web archive, and we have 3.6 terabytes of born digital map data sets. That's about 154 data sets. And we've got 56,000 digital music scores. Now, some of this collection is unique, especially the web archive. 50% of the web archive is lost after the first 2 years of it being available. So it's great that we're collecting it. But for some of the libraries, the legal deposit content is the only copy they have. So for example, Trinity College Dublin, 85% of their collections are legal deposit. So the question comes, what happens when you close the doors? What happens when the doors close on the library? So during lockdown, Trinity College Dublin were given 5 hours notice that they would have to close. That's not enough time for anyone to plan what research material they may need for the weeks ahead. In the UK, libraries and researchers were given more notice, but it's not always possible to know what material you will need, especially when you've got no idea how long the library doors will be closed. Within days of the library's closing, they were inundated with requests to open up access to electronic legal deposit material. I mean, the stuff is digital, why can't we access it from home? It's a logical argument. But even users who understood that it was the law and not the library's fault expected the libraries to push back against the legislation to try and open up access to legal deposit material. So the question is why didn't the libraries push to open up access during lockdown? Well, there are several reasons. There was an understanding from the chief librarians that government departments were dealing with a crisis, and they had so much to deal with that they had too much on to consider legal deposit. There was also an understanding that the publishers were already going out of their way to provide access to some content. Now, this was largely science, didn't open up access to humanities very much, but they were trying to do something. But in the back of the argument, there was the bigger picture. The legal deposit libraries want to improve access to the web archive content, and through an upcoming consultation, the librarians were concerned that by asking to open up access to legal deposit journals and books at this particular point in time may be considered to be opportunistic, and it may alienate the publishers and damage the chances of any long-term solution to wider access. So when lockdown happened, what did the libraries do? Well, lots of negotiations with publishers went on to increase digital access to print subscribed material or electronic subscribed material. Libraries bought electronic subscriptions to content that they already received under legal deposit. And some libraries partnered with the Hattie Trust to provide access electronically, all of which were done in great haste and at considerable cost to the libraries, especially when you considered that it was content that they already have in their collections. So what next? What next if we have further lockdowns? What next for our bigger picture? Well, in the next 6 to 18 months, we are expecting a DCMS, Department for Culture, Digital Culture, Media and Sport, consultation on several aspects of the legal deposit legislation. And we're hoping to get support for improving access. But in doing so, we also need to protect the rights of the publishers. They have a business to run, and many smaller publishers have really suffered during the lockdown. Many have gone under. If we allowed online access to all of the legal deposit content, other university librarians may direct their students to legal deposit collections instead of subscribing themselves. But for unique content such as the web archive, which is great for social history, the libraries feel that online access could be provided without damaging the publishing industry. And it's this area that we want to focus on in the upcoming consultation and get as much support as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. As someone who works on the UK Web Archive, that is a subject that's very dear to my heart. And I have, for example, a PhD student at the moment who can't use the digital collection because it's only accessible on site. So it's a real challenge for the legal deposit libraries. Our fourth speaker this afternoon is Maria Castrillo, who's Head of Special Collections and Engagement at the University of London's Senate House Library. And Maria is going to talk about some of the things that she's been doing while the building has been closed and partially while it's open as well. So Maria.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to take part in this very exciting session for History Day 2020. I will share my screen with you so you can see my presentation. Here we are. Okay. Okay. My presentation is going to be primarily, looking at how we have engaged our users and our audiences with our digital collections in the current climate and over the past few months. The library closed. Well, we're a membership library. We are the library of the University of London and the School of Advanced Study. So we cater for a very large group of institutions across, the Federation, the Federal University, and also for the school and the different institutes. So that's one of our primary audiences. we closed to the public on the 19th of March. And as a result of that closure, we had to bring forward some of our virtual services, which were going to be implemented in September this year. And yet we managed to work with our colleagues in IT and other teams in the Central University. And the week after we closed down, actually on the 23rd of March, we launched a series of applications and systems which enable us to continue to communicate with our users and to provide access to what we could provide access during this time. So what you can see in this screen is basically the different applications for LibChat, LibCal, and LibGuides, which have been our primary means of communication with, as I said, with our users and our customers. In addition to that, we also open up our digital collections and licensed content. And these are just some of the publishers with which the library has worked over the past few years on licensed content, particularly, digital resources. Some of them are part of our collection, some of them are not. And they belong to other institutions, but they've been basically almost like a lifesaver for many students. And it's interesting that through the first lockdown, we received a lot of good feedback from various users saying how wonderful it was that we had made this content available, that we had stepped up our e-resource offer and our license collections. And even during this time, we also launched a new license collection, which was the De Morgan collection. The first part of that major special collection in the House Library was digitized by April last year, and the content was released in spring. So again, that was another very exciting development for us, and very rewarding to see how we could expand, that offering for our users. One of the things we have been experimenting with during this period has been remote cataloging of unique material. And obviously, retroconversion of all archives finding aids was an obvious one to pursue. And this is something that we have continued to do obviously during the first lockdown, but also after the lockdown was eased, people still had to continue to work from home. So this was a route that we have explored and that, we have made great use of it. So we have converted a lot of our all finding aids into discoverable catalog records. But for me, what's been really interesting is to enable home cataloging of special collections. This is something we haven't done before. And we have piloted 2 projects. Obviously, this requires a collaborative approach across different teams in the library and involves the special collections team, the metadata team, the conservation team, and also colleagues in the Central University who help us with risk assessments. Basically, what we were doing was to bend the rules entirely and enabling people to take material home to catalog at home. So obviously, not all the material is suitable for this kind of activity. So we choose very carefully one of our major special collections, the Ron Heisler collection of left-wing literature. There is a very large body of pamphlet material that is easily portable. So as I said, we just basically measure the risks against the benefits. And in the end, we realized that this could be done, that we could at least try and see what happened. And so far, I can say that the benefits have outweighed the risks and any potential issues that could arise. We have also enabled the conversion of about 2,000 cards from the card catalog of the Porteous Library, which is another major special collection. So these projects are still ongoing, but as I said, it was an opportunity for us to bend the rules and experiment. Another area where we have tried to open up our collections, particularly for public audiences, is been through our public engagement program. So obviously our exhibition space had to close down to the public quite early on in March, and we switched all our activity to the online exhibition, which replicated the physical exhibition. And we also stepped up the number of blogs as a route into the collection, but also as a way to engage public audiences at a time when people were feeling quite isolated and in a very unusual situation. Obviously, we use all our social media channels to engage with different campaigns, different initiatives which were happening during those months. And more recently, we've been experimenting, particularly my colleagues in the Modern Collections team, have been experimenting with online inductions, which for us is something quite important at the beginning of the academic year. And finally, I would like to finish my presentation with some of the lessons we've learned and some of the questions we are asking ourselves at the moment, which I think that might be common to other institutions as well. So obviously you can still make collections available in different ways. That's one of the key lessons. You need to use collaborative approaches, both inside the organization and outside the organization. Staff involvement is essential. They're really part of the solution to the situation we're in. And also make the most of technology, open access resources and sources, and particularly be brave and don't be afraid to experiment, even if you don't succeed at first. I think that's really, really important. In terms of main questions that we're asking ourselves, particularly going forward in the next few months, is how do we make digital access to history collections sustainable? Obviously here the question is open access versus income generation, or can both coexist? How do we bridge the digital gap and make digital history and collections truly inclusive? And again, here the question is equity versus equality. And this is something which many organizations are, looking at the moment. It's not just us. And finally, how do we reimagine our engagement with public audiences when the horizon still looks uncertain? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And that's picking up on some of the themes that we've already heard around communication and collaboration and cataloguing. So I'm sure we can pick some of that up in the questions. And our final speaker before we get on to the discussion is Mia Ridge, who is digital curator for Western Heritage Collections at the British Library and also co-investigator on the wonderful Living with Machines project. Mia.
Thank you, Jane. Okay. Wow, thank you everyone who's presented already. It's been a lot to think about, and I really appreciate the way you're sharing your experiences in this uniquely difficult moment. And thank you for the opportunity to share something of what we're doing in Living with Machines. So Living with Machines is a 5-year research project. We're trying to take a fresh look at the well-known, perhaps well-worn history of the Industrial Revolution using data-driven approaches applied to digitized collections at scale. And the scale really adds to the challenge. We're using the collections of the British Library digitized by Find My Past with the British Newspaper Archive. We're also aiming to create new forms of radical collaboration. So historians and data scientists, curators and librarians working together in truly equitable ways and not one in service of the other. So it's a very data intensive project. So I will introduce 2 examples that speak to some of the aims of the project on the screen here. One is a crowdsourcing project that creates a lexicon that feeds into linguistic research, and the other is computer vision methods applied to maps, and I'll show those in a second. I think the thing to note about this project is that we're not creating interfaces or resources for direct use by other researchers. We're creating data that can be used by others that will enrich the British Library's holdings. Our main outcomes in terms of things outside the project are the research, the papers, the methods. We're doing a lot of work to create tools backed up by tutorials and documentation and workshops that help people apply these methods in their own research. So we're not trying to be a one-stop shop, we're just trying to inspire more research with digital history methods throughout the field. So this is an example of a crowdsourcing task we're using. So crowdsourcing is presenting, in this case, microtasks, very small self-contained tasks to the public, and asking them to complete these tasks to as a sort of voluntary activity that contributes to a greater goal. In the library, we have a lot of experience in crowdsourcing, but it's tended to be about the creation of metadata or transcribing text that can't be transcribed by computational tools, either handwritten material or material that uses a variety of fonts and typefaces and doesn't work with optical character recognition. And we've done a lot of work with maps, georeferencing them as well. But this is a new kind of approach for us where we're trying to work with researchers to tie the results of the crowdsourcing task very closely to the research within the project. which means a sort of learning curve in terms of the computational linguistic methods that are being applied within the project, so that we can match an enjoyable task to quite complex abstract methods. So in this task, we ask people to look at Victorian newspapers. We've highlighted text where it mentions the machine or this machine, and ask them to give us the sense in which the phrase machine is used in this particular article. It's the kind of thing that people are really good at doing because we're good at reading an article and picking up contextual clues to assign meaning to the phrase this machine or the machine, where software isn't very good at that. So we'll use this as training data for machine learning methods so that we can scale up our inquiries. So working with this kind of process to for really complex emergent research questions has been quite challenging, but really enjoyable. It's meant bridging different disciplinary perspectives to understand what data means, what kinds of sampling processes, how much data we need to be valid. So it's very different to the usual metadata conversations I have in the library. And the next example is applying computer vision to maps. So we are looking at Ordnance Survey maps. They're lovely if you know the area, but they can be quite dry if you're just looking at them as a whole. We're looking firstly at how much of the country is covered by Ordnance Survey maps at different times, but we're also applying methods to try and pull out meaning from the maps. So looking at the actual features drawn on the maps and understand the visual patterns that represent different kinds of changes in the industrial landscape. In this particular example, the researchers are looking at the coming of the rail lines and how that changed the landscape, how that changed cities and towns. They're applying all kinds of really exciting methods, and it's a true collaboration between the data scientists, the historians, and others to develop these new methods. And they think that it allows them to scale up their inquiry. So within a week, they can produce something that would have taken them years to do otherwise, between a combination of manually annotating records and taking those annotations and scaling them up with machine learning. So thank you for listening. These are some links to find out more about the project. There's a lot of information on the website and there's a lot more to come. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mia. Some really groundbreaking digital history there, but also involving the crowdsourcing collaborative element that we've heard about already. We've got a couple of questions in the chat which relate to specific university access and specific resources. And unfortunately, we can't answer those, but I think the fact that you're having these problems really speaks to these challenges around, I guess, general challenges of getting access to material while we're all based at home and unable to travel and so on. But the first question has come through for Jonathan Blaney, and that's from Richard Sylvester, and it's about the business model for British History Online, really, Jonathan. How is it funded?
Oh, well, actually, Jane and I wrote a whole article about this a few years ago. You're obviously not keeping up with the Bulletin of the Belgian Royal Historical Society, otherwise you'd know the answer. Well, to start off with, BHO cost a lot of money to set up. So we got, you can call it seed money, but it was a lot more than that from the Mellon Foundation, which really allowed the initial digitization and setup of the infrastructure. What keeps us going now fundamentally is subscriptions. So as I put in the chat, you can subscribe as an individual to to get all the transcriptions on BHO for £35 a year, but also libraries, university libraries principally subscribe on behalf of all their members too, and that's really what funds us. We do have, if you don't have a subscription, you might see some ads in the sidebar. That brings in a small amount of money, but nothing really very substantial. It's really through subscriptions. And that's why we're very grateful to all of our subscribers, because they actually do keep the site going.
Great, thank you. I don't know, Linda or Maria, if you wanted to comment on the economics of this and that balance between open and making sure that publishers are still able to function. Linda.
Yeah, I can come in about legal deposit. I think there's this misnomer that things are digital and therefore free. And for the libraries who are embarking on legal deposit, the cost is astronomical. I mean, since we started this process since the government said that we needed to start collecting digitally, we've spent around £38 million to set up the network to make it work. And for the publishers, it's there's a cost in producing digital, but there is also a benefit in depositing their content to us in a digital way rather than a print way, because they don't have the cost of printing. So, there's swings and roundabouts. The cost burden is currently on the public sector, but over time, the benefit will be greater, and accessibility to content, even if you have to go on site for it, is still quicker than getting a member of staff to go and retrieve it from stores. So the costs it's really interesting dynamic that we have to consider. I think Mia's response will be a different response because it's a different project.
Okay, we have a couple of questions then for Katherine from Joanna Ratcliffe and Richard Sylvester. I'll run those together. And it's really about how you ran the remote cataloguing project that you were talking about, and particularly the recruitment and training of the volunteers.
Yes, so essentially before we started using remote cataloguing, at least for my project, we have volunteers come in, train them up personally. It's a very sort of one-to-one basis of doing the cataloguing for Copy One, and that works well. And it's you have more control over that in a way, because you have sort of personal relationship with the volunteer and you can work together on it. Doing it remotely, there are benefits to that. The speed is one of the main benefits. The volunteers, because it's crowdsourced, anybody can do it. We don't recruit volunteers as such, they come to us. So we use this platform called From the Page, which lots of organizations use, and you can develop your own project on there. So you digitize the material if it's not already digitized, put it up there, create the instructions, and then set it off on its way. And these things are incredibly popular. I've done one box of the Copy One images as a pilot, and I didn't even actively promote it particularly, but it was finished much quicker than I'm able to actually upload them, which is great. But so in the same way, you don't have as much control. So it's a very interesting process, because you learn a little bit more about how to actually instruct people on how to catalog. You write your instructions and you think that you've covered everything, but then as people are cataloging, they comment on the platform. They tell us, oh, did you mean this? Was this how you wanted me to do it? And then we learn from that, which is really useful. And then the issues with it, of course, as I said, are just the speed that people get through it means that we have to digitize it very quickly. And Copy One, in some ways, is good for digitization, and good for remote cataloging and cataloging in general, because each form is standard. So there are particular fields that people fill in, and they're all the same. So that's great from a cataloging point of view, because we can just fill those fields in. It's not like they have to interpret a letter or anything like that. That's great. The problem with it is each one is written by a different person, handwritten. So obviously the handwriting varies hugely. And then the images attached to the forms are very different. Some of them are tiny and not a problem, don't get in the way of photographing the document. Some are huge and folded up many times, and it's just impossible to photograph them. So in each case, we have to weigh up again, the pros and cons of doing it. For the box we've done, not every single item has been photographed, because some of them are just too unwieldy to do. So we'll see how this box has gone down, and when I check the transcriptions, we can review it and then see how it carries on. But I think this is going to be, whatever happens with reopening and how we can get volunteers back in, this will be something we will pursue, because it's worth it. Even though it's time consuming to digitize, to get it to happen, it's so much quicker to be crowdsourcing to get the input of thousands of people around the world. So we'll definitely do it. And From the Page is a great platform. I'll put the link in the chat actually, because we've had my projects on there, but we do have some other ones as well that you could look at if anyone's interested in getting involved in that, and obviously other organizations that you can transcribe for as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question is for Maria, and it's from Paola Macchioni about the licensed collections that you were talking about. And could you say a little bit more about the way you made them available that was different from the way you would have done that before lockdown?
Yeah, well, basically, I mean, one of the things, we expanded our offer. We try to expand those ones. One of the difficulties, I suppose, for us is the fact that, you need to be a library member to be able to access them. So our model is slightly different, for example, to the model operated by the British Library. But one of the things that our e-resources manager managed to do was to negotiate better terms and greater accessibility. So the students who at the time were maybe finalizing their PhDs or their master dissertations, or just simply completing, their essays, for their courses, or, just simply looking for research materials, they could access, a lot more material because the terms of access were improved. And we also benefited from open access content that, a lot of these publishers were also making available for a limited period of time. So that that was also quite beneficial to users.
Great. Thank you, Maria. And the next one is from Kelvin Beer-Jones, which I think is really for Mia and Jonathan particularly. Really questioning how far you practice what you preach, I suppose. How open are you in your own work? For example, are you sharing code and methods on sites like GitHub?
Yeah, it's been really important to me that we practice what we preach, particularly in crowdsourcing, where people often don't quite deliver on the promise to share data with participants, the same as many academic research projects where the data plan is sort of the last thing to actually be operationalized. So we went through the process of putting crowdsourced data from our very first task onto the British Library repository to ensure that we had everything sort of lined up in terms of workflow, permissions, copyright licensing, sort of clear licenses for the data, so that the next time we want to do it, there's a path already to do that. And I've mentioned in the chat that on the front page of our website, there's a link to our GitHub. It's a public repository, so it's not our working repository, but as we finalize and tidy code and document it well, that gets moved over into the public repository. And actually having it used by others is one of our key performance indicators. So it's a really important metric for us. And we're making extensive use of the British Library's research repository for data sets and for research publications as well. So it's a very important part for me in the project in reaching historians who might not be within academic institutions and a lot of other users of the library.
Jonathan, did you want to add anything to that?
Just to add that we get different data from different people, and we always ask them, what license do you want to put on this data? And if as we encourage they go for some kind of open license, then we do create a GitHub repository. Just to elaborate on something Mia said about not always following through, it is an extra task that we have to do on top of everything else. So sometimes we're a bit late with creating that repository, and the petitions data is open access, but I haven't actually yet got around to creating that repository. So in principle, yes. In theory, sometimes a little bit slow, but we are doing it.
Great, thank you. And we have a great question then from Anna Briggs, who's picking up on the communications theme that so many of you touched on. For all the panelists, whether they could talk about how they've used social media or other digital networks to engage particularly with non-traditional audiences with their collections. Who wants to take that one first?
I'm happy, to start, and then Well, one of the we have 3 different platforms which are quite common across the board: Twitter, obviously, Facebook, and Instagram. So one of the ways in which we engaged through this period with non-traditional audiences was through engaging with national campaigns, like, for example, towards a national collection or connecting collections. The Archives and Records Association runs a series of campaigns through the year via the Explore Archives and Curators Battle. So we just basically try to tap into a lot of that activity that was happening at national and sometimes international level, and just basically try to generate content which could be interesting, to non-traditional users of the library. Our blog was also a very important way for us to communicate with non-traditional audiences, particularly at a time when people were not able to visit libraries or to visit exhibitions. So it was almost like a window into the collections and also into the exhibition, the Childhood Digitalisation London exhibition, which we moved entirely online. So we've managed, to generate a lot of interest via social media. I don't have the stats in front of me at the moment, but throughout this period, the number of followers, the number of people who are not necessarily members of the library has increased enormously. And there's been significant peaks, for example, in the run-up to the Being Human Festival. And we are the advertising of some of our events, like, for example, some time machine cafes that, we put together for Being Human, the Terry Pratchett event, last Tuesday. So, there were significant peaks of activity. And we tried to basically tailor our, public engagement offer to basically tap into those audiences which, were not able to visit libraries, museums, theaters, all these kinds of, cultural venues.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, would you like to say something about how you communicate what British History Online is doing, particularly the sort of emergency opening up of material during the first lockdown?
Yeah, that's really mostly done through institutional channels because we have much bigger reach with the IHR's Twitter account and Facebook and all those kinds of things. We do have a BHO account that's less popular, perhaps because I run it. So I largely rely on the expertise of colleagues rather than my own. So I'm not the best person to give anyone advice on social media campaigns.
And Katherine and Mia, we've talked a little bit about recruiting for crowdsourcing and so on already, but presumably you're trying to reach out to as wide an audience as possible there. So Mia, would you like to say something about the success of your crowdsourcing activities during lockdown?
Yeah, well, I think like most projects, we saw what we could call the lockdown effect, where tasks were completed really quickly. So on Living with Machines, we had a kind of sample task up, and that was completed within a fortnight. I quickly turned around another task, a new kind of task, and that was completed again really quickly. And on our Playbills LibCrowds project, we were sort of scrambling to add new volumes to be processed all the time. I think for me, it was really, it felt like a constructive thing to do, to give people a choice other than doom scrolling and just sort of looking at depressing worldwide news coming in. But it's hard to reach people because there are so many crowdsourcing projects. It's not the kind of thing that you can do a press release and have it picked up anymore. So it takes more work to find communities of practice, to find people who might already be interested in the kinds of tasks that you offer or the material that you offer.
Katherine, did you want to add anything there about engaging new audiences?
Yeah, so obviously, yeah, we had the lockdown effect as well with our crowdsourcing for transcription projects, but also we have tried to could use this opportunity to widen our reach a little bit more. So we've been, particularly with visual collections, trying to concentrate on obviously we use Twitter and Facebook, but trying to move into Instagram a little bit more and trying to get into those communities there who are often interested in the visual side of it, and sort of developing campaigns that we can do on a weekly basis that just sort of show off some of the material that we have and to new audiences, get them involved. Also, again, it's all these things that we would have wanted to do before, but it did sort of give us an opportunity to really get them done. A lot more videos. Video content seems to go down really well, and some of the things we've been doing more recently now, staff have been able to go into the National Archives again and see some of the records again, which for some time we couldn't do at all. But since some of us has been able to go back, we've been able to do things like create document displays, film document displays, things like that we can then share, or that are getting involved in the Archives from Home campaigns where different staff could have a little mini video where they explain something that's interesting to them and show it in real life. I think that's been really, really wonderful. And actually, even whenever things were open, there were obviously a lot of people who couldn't access our records just due to distance and being able to visit us. So getting more involved in finding ways to show the records in video form has been really good, and getting more of our staff involved in doing that has been very, very effective. And I hope I'm sure we will continue doing that kind of thing.
I think that's been such an interesting development. I know in the University of London, there was always this idea that you couldn't produce videos for anything unless they were produced to incredibly high production standards, and the tolerance around what you can do with video now and being a bit more relaxed about it has been something that I think has really emerged out of all of this. And I hope we do, as you say, keep hold of that.
Exactly. I was just going to say, yeah, and I think sometimes the more casual way of doing it, a little bit more personal, can be more effective. Sometimes it can make it feel more real, and you can actually get to know the archivist who's talking about the record, rather than it always being a sort of swish kind of well-designed video.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question from Joanne Anthony that's linked a little bit to what we've just been talking about. Maria, you noted key issues of equity and inclusivity, and that's something that's been discussed obviously through the whole of this past year particularly. So the question for everybody really, how are you all adapting your approaches to managing digital projects and collections in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, or even if not particularly that movement, generally around issues of inclusivity and equality? I don't know, Maria, since you raised it, why don't you start?
Well, I mean, I don't think we have an answer to that yet, but it's a question that we are obviously asking ourselves, because one of the most immediate consequences of this situation is that people can come in person to the library because of the restrictions, and particularly, for example, people who are have underlying health issues. So we have obviously to adapt our spaces and our capacity to cope, with access to the library's collections. So one thing that will be really important going forward is ensuring that we can explore other ways in which we can provide enhanced access, because it's not obvious to me that we're going to go back to normal immediately, even after this second lockdown. So one of the things that I think we need to explore very carefully is how we balance, obviously, for example, income generation through digitization or licensing content with providing access to the collections to people who normally would have come to us in the past, but now for a number of reasons they can come. And a possibility, for example, would be to explore virtual reading rooms, which is a model that is being explored by various institutions. I've seen, for example, the one done in Reading University Library, which is really, is really interesting. And there are other institutions across the country that are beginning to experiment with that. And for example, arranging individual appointments with, librarians and archivists, so you can guide people through the collections in a more mediated way than, we would have done previously. I think another important thing to consider, and I'm sure, Jane, you have come across this, and everybody else in the panel, is copyright. To what extent the copyright law can be relaxed to enhance and make that access a lot more equitable than it is at the moment. So until very recently, it was a question of, well, licensing material, but now it's more a question about actually making that access more making access fair, if that makes any sense.
It does.
So I think copyright is going to be a really interesting debate. It was before the lockdown, but I think it's not going to go away. I think in the context of digital, this digital world in which we're operating, it will be even more important. So it will be very interesting to see how that debate pans out.
Linda, I don't know if you wanted, that obviously connects to your what you were saying about legal deposit and that idea of fairness around access. Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think fairness is a really interesting thing, because we see a very London-centric view of the world from here up north, because I'm based in Yorkshire today. And the libraries, getting access to libraries is not just limited to, it should not be limited to people who are academic. It should be available to everybody, but not everybody can get to the libraries. And I think there's a fundamental flaw in our national collection. So we are collecting for the nation under legal deposit, and not everybody can access it. So there is an element of fairness there that we need to address. And for me, the web archive, as you've explained before, is a great opportunity, but most people don't know about it. But that's a resource that could be, it kind of breaks down the barriers of academia and social science and social historians, local historians, that we need to break down to make to let us have an equitable world. And I think that we really need to push the boundaries there to facilitate more fairness within our society. It's a great opportunity. It'd be a shame if we lost that.
Yeah. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on this?
I think one of the things I'm very aware of working in digital scholarship is the intersection of fairness, equality, and digital tools. And I think that goes back to the questions about Black Lives Matter. Since we began planning this project in about 2017, I'd started in our digital scholarship reading group introducing readings on AI and ethics, and they'd sort of been a core part of our readings anyway, but thinking about the way that algorithms and the training data used in machine learning and artificial intelligence brings in the same biases that we have in society, combined with biases in historical data sets, language that we wouldn't regard as appropriate now, that's either on the original page or had been applied in previous cataloging. So I think one of the contributions that we can make as a project is encouraging people to think about the intersection of ethics, new tools, new methods for digital history and digital cultural heritage, and the possible harms that they can introduce as well as the benefits.
Great, thank you. We're very nearly out of time. As usual, we haven't got to nearly all of the questions. So perhaps we could finish with a very specific one that Jonathan could perhaps pick up, which is about how open projects and institutions are about what they're digitizing to avoid duplication. And I guess there are questions of value there as well, so that money's not being spent multiple times to digitize things rather than sharing.
That's a tricky one. It's a really good question. We do check quite carefully that we're not digitizing things which are available elsewhere on British History Online, because that would be pointless. But I don't know of any kind of central repository of lists of who's planning to do what over the next few years or that kind of thing. So there is duplication, and you've all found things in different digitized forms in different places, but we, at least at British History Online, try to avoid that because it's not in our interest, because it's so expensive for us to digitize even one book.
Could you talk a little bit about licensing there as well, Jonathan, and encouraging the people whose data that you publish to use the most open licenses possible, so that there isn't this need to duplicate? You can just republish in lots of different places.
Yeah, every time people offer us data or transcriptions or electronic forms, we ask them what license they want, but we steer them towards something like Creative Commons, share alike with attribution. That's our favored license. And nearly everyone in recent years, I think this is a change really in people's perspective about their data and what might happen to it, has been very happy to share their data on that license. So it's very rare people say, oh no, I'm worried someone will steal my credit or take my work. That doesn't really happen anymore, at least in our experience. So it's definitely moving in that direction. We just need people to know that it's on BHO before they digitize it separately themselves, I suppose.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I think this experience where all of us, I'm sure, will have had material that they can't access makes you think rather differently about your own practices as an author and researcher or genealogist or whatever it is, to put your information out into the open if you can. So thank you very much to our audience for some wonderful wide-ranging questions which have picked up some really fascinating ideas which I wish we had more time to explore. So thank you. And thank you also to our fantastic panelists who I think showed the spread of their expertise, and it's a really wonderful session. Thank you all very much.